Yes.
But let me first, before I get into the first screen, let me first say something. As I said, listening to Igor, I think the important thing that he said was that it depends on where you are from. And he could have added who you are. I speak from India. The context of the pandemic now here is that the number of infected cases has gone beyond 400,000. The expectation is by the end of next month, July, maybe second or third week, we could cross 1 million cases. The fear is that that's not where we're going to stop. Actually, we would hit the peak even a month or two later. So some scientists are saying that India could actually be the largest number of infected cases in the world. So we have a very serious health crisis on our hands. Compounded by, of course, the fact of one of the most severe lockdowns anywhere in the world, which has led to an economic crisis, which is hard to describe sitting here. Let me just mention that about 120 million people lost their jobs. Yes, you heard me right. 120 million people lost their job within a week. This is substantially bigger than the greatest economic crisis that we read about in textbooks of depression in the US. The situation is returning to slightly better levels, but we are still dealing with the worst economic crisis of the last 4 decades, certainly. And to make matters worse, we have a border conflict with China going on for the last 1 week, which resulted in the death of some Indian soldiers 3 or 4 days ago. And our regime is making things worse by using the pretext of the pandemic to arrest human rights activists, to try and use it to spread hatred against communities, to use it to divide. So as Igor and Florian were talking about, a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis, that's really the condition I speak from. I'm not a scientist, unlike most of you. I used to be a political scientist. I'm not a political scientist anymore. I'm a full-time political worker. And just to give you a sense of where I come from, my origins are in the socialist tradition, not in the communist Marxist tradition, but in the democratic socialist tradition that has been very strong in India and have been deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. This just by way of introduction. So I thought, when you're in the middle of so many crises, you could do 2 things. One, you can try and explain the depth and nature of crisis to an unfamiliar audience and spend 1 hour doing that. Or you can just abstract yourself from all those crises and talk about something very general. I'm afraid I've chosen the second route. So what I'm going to talk about is something which does not at all talk about the current crisis in India. I would be very happy to answer questions about that if you have that kind of interest. But I thought I'd use this occasion to talk about something very general, very abstract, almost a manifesto-like, which is the whole point about what should the post-COVID world be like? What would it look like? What should it look like? That's what I thought I would put in the form of a manifesto. Yes, we can share screen now. So I thought I would put it in the form of a manifesto of kind, which would be about what the world can and should be like. Yes, this is the correct one. Yeah. Just we go to presentation. Just give me a second. Yeah, we'll go to.
Take your time.
Now, can you see the presentation?
Yes, you are now on the full screen and we can see it.
Oh, excellent. You can see a manifesto for Swaraj in our times.
Indeed.
Yes, you might be intrigued. What is Swaraj? I'll come back to that towards the end of my presentation. I should have mentioned that I'm a member of a political party. I'm its current president these days. That's called Swaraj India. No coincidence. All right. So the point that I want to make is that this corona crisis, in a sense, shows all that is wrong with what modern civilization wants to tell us about itself, its autobiography. The problem is not that human beings have faced a fury of nature for the first time. That has been a very standard thing. What is new is our response. Amitav Ghosh, the Indian author, has described it in some place by saying, this is the interesting thing about our response is the sense of disbelief that we have, loss of a sense of human invincibility, that, you know, we could possibly go wrong, and how easily we have surrendered to our own creation. You know, human beings' sense of disbelief that the things that we created, they don't work. How could it be? This is the sense of disbelief characterizes the current situation. And in many ways, it shows something deep about our civilizational failure. It shows us something about hollowness of the promise of happiness, inability to come to terms with the simple fact of death. It shows us collapse of cognitive arrogance, precarious nature of what we have come to know as development. It has exposed the fake nature of social bonding in global village. And it has shown limits to democratic self-governance, something that came up in the previous conversation as well. Now hold these 5 things in your mind as I proceed to talk about what we need to, how we need to think about. To my mind, this crisis actually offers us an opportunity. It has given, as if someone has put a pause button. In India, we could experience it. For 70 days, the country was under a lockdown. Everything was paused. You could not get a haircut. You could, of course, not travel. Everyone was so unhappy with the pause. The only saving grace about the pause is that it enables you to think afresh. It enables you to break from habits of mind. You have 2 paths open to you. One, of course, is to cling even more tightly to the previous model, which is what we all do. In a crisis, the first temptation is to cling even more tightly to whatever existed before that. So we look for vaccine as a savior. We all go back to nationalism even more fiercely than in the past. We all believe that there would be a V-turn recovery, markets will bounce back, everything would be lovely. And these democratic leaders will come as a savior. We all suspect that that's not going to happen. But that's our first response. Can we have a different response? And my sense is that that's what we need to think about. We need to take a new path which can be seen in new practices that are emerging all over the world, and which is also emerging in a new set of ideas. And to my mind, this Solidarity Conference is itself an example of a new kind of ideas that are being tossed around, that are being discussed, which is what interests me, and that's why I'm here. In this grand overview, let me say what we are witnessing right now, and this pandemic is only an instance, it's only a pretext, an occasion for us to get to see that more clearly, is that there are 5 fundamental human quests, values, strivings, call it by any name. You know, human beings need these 5 things for which we create systems, orders, and so on. We have created 5 mega templates in order to respond to that. Which are these 5 values or quests? Self-rule, belonging, a sense of belonging, you want to connect to someone, a sense of material well-being, a cognitive sense, quest for truth, and a sense of happiness. These are 5 things human beings want. And we have at the moment created these 5 mega templates. I don't call them systems. I don't call them simply orders is in them. These are mega templates. These templates tell us, all right, if you want to have self-rule, here is the way in which you can have self-rule. So liberal democracy is the template for self-rule. For sense of belonging and community, nation state is the available template. For sense of well-being, our neoliberal capitalism. I also, like my friends before, you know, keep changing the the exact prefix to capitalism. What kind of capitalism are we talking about? But for the time being, let's call it neoliberal capitalism. For truth, the template, of course, is positivist science, objectivist positivist science. And for happiness, a template for quite some time has been institutionalized religion. The first four of these are very modern. The fifth one is not so modern, but has taken new forms these days. Now, the interesting thing about these templates is, and in a sense, the root of the crisis that we face today is this, that each of these mega templates have turned against these very human quests that they seek to realize. So in a sense, human creations have turned against ourselves. In a sense, these are robots which have taken charge of our lives and are actually now forcing us to do things that we didn't want them to do. That really, in a sense, captures what is happening to us as a civilization all over the world. And it is important that we can see it more from the margins. It's harder to see what's wrong when you are sitting in the heart of modern civilization. But if you happen to be in the periphery, on the margins, as I do, as both of my friends earlier said they did, you begin to see what's happening to these mega templates. Because in a sense, these mega templates promise you something which they never deliver. And what they actually deliver is something they keep calling an exception. And most of the world, most of the time, keeps imagining that they are in a temporary exception which would go away very soon, and they would come to the real, proper, correct destination, which of course never arrives. So these mega templates, the characteristics are that they have rigid design, drawn from a tiny part of the world and a slice of history of that part, maybe from, in some ways, from the early 20th century Western Europe, maybe in some cases from the US of a few years, but a tiny part of the world gives templates to the entire world now. And these templates are, they claim ultimate loyalty. They make ultimate claims to truth, to loyalty. They monopolize, they tell you this is the only way you can realize. If you want well-being, well, this is the only way you can realize well-being. They are global in the sense that they tell everyone in the world, look, you have no option. Everyone must conform to this. So please turn democratic in the way that we design it to be. Otherwise, you are no good. And it promises to be eternal. There was a talk of end of history, that this is, so after a long struggle, we have arrived at these things, and that's the way it ought to be. In reality, they have varying consequences. So what they do is that either these quests get fragmented or humanity is split. So what usually happens with these templates is that they realize the ideal in a tiny part of the universe. And for the rest, it's an eternal longing, eternal search, which never ends, which never arrives. What we have instead are monster versions of these templates, which these mega templates present as if these are distortions, but that's actually what they are intended to produce. These templates are beginning to give way. And for me, this is important. It's important to think about the templates because in this time, especially during COVID, during coronavirus crisis, we can begin to see some sources of change. There is atrophy, there is germination of new ideas, and there are innovative hybrids which allow us to think afresh. So these are the reasons why we need to think carefully. What I will do now is to very quickly go through, just mention these 5 templates and what's happening to them. Before I finally close it by mentioning the idea of Swaraj and why it enables us to think about future in a more creative way. In liberal democracy, the quest is, of course, freedom from external control. And we are told that popular sovereignty exercised by elected representatives through competitive election all over the world will achieve that. The reality, however, is that it achieves self-rule for a few in a selected places for a very short period. But for most part of humanity, it actually is disempowering. as it actually leads to concentration of power for the party, oligarchies controlled by money, and public opinion controlled by media, which in turn is controlled by money and politics. What we have instead of democracy, are electoral authoritarianism. That's how I characterize my country increasingly now. It is not democracy, it is electoral authoritarianism. Or we have populist democracies. It is time for us to begin to think about decentralization, participatory democracy, and deliberative democracies. These are the ideals towards which we are beginning to think about. On the template of nation state offered us freedom from solitude, from loneliness, offered us community. And the design was, well, let's match political boundaries with cultural boundaries. And then you have neatly drawn out communities. And who would know the tragedy better than people living in Yugoslavia? What happened. Incidentally, what connects India and Yugoslavia is also the fact that in India, we have very fond memories of Yugoslavia. Delhi city, where I live in, is one of the few cities in the world where we still have a street named after Marshal Tito. So yes, living there, many of my friends would know how the tragedy that this has created, the idea of nation state, because it creates belonging at the cost of hatred for the neighbors and homogenization within. In Europe, in colonizing countries, it produced homogenization within and jingoism outside, xenophobia, as someone mentioned. In the colonized societies, initially, the idea of nation and nationalism was very positive. It was very enabling because it created a bond of unity within and outside with other colonized people. But gradually, they have all fallen into the European pattern of this being more a source of hatred than a source of belonging. We have jingoist nationalism and chauvinism that we see everywhere. This is a place to begin to think of new forms of belonging, post-colonial nationalism, communitarianism, and international solidarity come to mind. Neoliberal capitalism, I don't need to spend too much time on that because that's something everyone would be more familiar with. It promised us freedom from wants. The design was private property, free market, global movement of capital. The consequences have been that it's bifurcated. There are islands of prosperity amidst oceans of misery and deprivation. We have concentration of economic power and of course, ecological destruction that everyone is familiar with. And what we have is the deformity of crony capitalism, where you have neither equality nor growth, which is just pure plunder. And in terms of alternatives, it is not the good old socialism. We need to move beyond that, but we need to think about forms of cooperative ownership, appropriate technology, and ecologically sustainable forms of production and consumption. Fourth, and I don't wish to take issues with my scientist friends here, but positivist science was provided as a template for truths, which promised us freedom from ignorance and falsehood. The objective was, the design was objective knowledge, value-free, scientific method, and technology as the ultimate litmus test of the success of science. Consequences really have been that a certain form of knowledge has been advanced in some sectors, in some discipline, and in some countries in a way that has helped humanity enormously. At the same time, we must be conscious of the fact that there has been an erasure of existing knowledge in other sectors, other domains, and many other geographies, many other parts of the world. There has been an erasure of existing knowledge. So it's not all pure advancement of human knowledge that we have witnessed. And the deformity is technicism. Technology rules. Technology tells you what human knowledge is, which leads to a Western hegemony all over the world. And in terms of alternatives, we need to think of modern, more modest epistemic claims of science, drawing upon practical knowledge and giving greater respect to existing forms of knowledges. The fifth and the final one is institutionalized religions, which I said is not modern. It actually starts before that. The quest is happiness. It promises you freedom for self-realization, freedom within, as it were. The design is a classic design of Abrahamic religions. You have one single God, prophet, one sacred book, one centralized church, rituals of initiation into that religion, and neat demarcation from other religion. Now, the consequence of this has been alienation from the self. Instead of freeing you from the self, institutionalized religions have actually, in a sense, created split human beings, split personalities. And the deformity that we see today in the name of fundamentalism or the spiritual markets that have opened up all over the world is that kind of deformity which results from that. We need to think about soft, non-institutionalized religions, open and spiritual movements. That brings me to the final thing I wanted to say. I'm sorry I have to rush through all this. Maybe I planned to do more than I should have, but that's the last point I wanted to make. So how do we begin to think about all these in the new world that begins to reopen now? I would suggest that Swaraj is an ideological canopy. As a concept, it's an umbrella concept that allows us to think about alternatives in all these 5 domains in an integrated view. What is Swaraj? It's a word derived from Sanskrit, and it's a compound of Swa and Raj. Swa literally means self. Raj, as in British Raj, means rule. It's an ideal that you find in ancient Indian texts and an ideal that was made popular during the anti-colonial struggle in India, because the war cry of Indian anti-colonial struggle was, we want Swaraj. For them, of course, Swaraj simply meant self-rule in a limited sense of freedom from external colonial bondage. That is what I call Swaraj 1.0. That's not something which is relevant for the rest of the world. It's an idea of limited provenance. But what we want is Swaraj 2.0, rule by self, which is Swaraj in rule of the self in a dual sense of the term. Rule by the self, not by someone else, and rule over the self. This is what Mahatma Gandhi said. Mahatma Gandhi said, well, you want Swaraj, so all you want is for the white man to leave. Does that give you Swaraj? No, he said, that doesn't give you Swaraj, unless you learn to rule yourself. And that, he said, is a long-term civilizational task, which is what he set Indians thinking. And therefore, this Swaraj 2.0 is freedom from bondage in every sense of the term, which is at least in 2 senses of the term. Swaraj is freedom from external constraints, freedom from negative, it's in the negative freedom, and Swaraj in a positive sense as freedom from internal constraints, positive freedom. Now, I wanted to suggest that if we want to write a manifesto for a post-COVID universe, maybe the idea of Swaraj is an umbrella theoretical concept that allows us to pick the energy from 20th century movements. In a sense, it allows us to think of various movements, socialist, feminist, environmentalist, anti-colonial struggles, and deeper forms of spiritualism together under one single umbrella. That is what we must begin to think about. These are abstract ideas, but as I said, living in times of crisis upon crisis upon crisis, it's important to be able to look beyond these crises. It's important to be able to think of a world, not just beyond COVID corona crisis, but a world beyond the divisions of the 20th century, a world beyond the mental habits that we have all been inculcated to think about, a world, a future world that you and I can make. So I'll stop there. I hope it has made some sense. I do realize that this is just too abstract a call in these times, but would be happy to answer any thoughts, or listen to any comments. And yes, if anyone wanted anything specific on India, I'm very happy to answer that as well.
Thank you so much for this very touching, very philosophical, and yet very applied talk.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we are all very moved by it. And if this is what politics mean, I will also become a politician. So thank you. Well, I first want to, I don't want to go like in the previous session and not give the audience a chance to ask questions. So please, would the audience like to start? And then I will ask my questions later.
I have got one small question.
Yes.
If I could, maybe I have been lost in the way because I am not really a specialist in the field of political sciences, but I am very interested in it. It's just a simple question: which is the main point of the difference between the freedom that how is the idea? I don't remember the name with the Raj. What is the main? Yes. What is the main difference between the liberty and freedom of this system and the liberty of freedom of the neoliberalism system? What is the main point there in short?
Lovely. Thank you. And that helps me to make the point I should have probably made earlier. In the neoliberal system, the idea of liberty is reduced to one or two levels. The level is either it's individual liberty, my liberty as one person to enjoy certain individual freedoms, or the liberty of a nation state, which is in the sense of a national sovereignty. So that is a negative liberty against external restraints. What the idea of Swaraj enables us to do is to expand its meaning. It does not negate that. It realizes the value of individual freedom. But what we do is to expand it to include positive sense of freedom as well. Not merely freedom against, but freedom for. Not merely for the individual, but also for communities. Not merely for the nation state, but also for the world as a whole. So in my notion of Swaraj, it is not just individual liberty, it is also, and not just sovereignty, it's also global, the capacity of different sovereign states to be able to live together, which brings in the notion of peace, solidarity, which also enables us to look within, and the question of freedom. I mean, in the Indian traditions, we call it moksha, which is in the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition, which is to think of your freedom from internal bondage that you have created for yourself. That is as much a part of freedom that we don't talk about. So these are the notions. So in a sense, I have an eightfold typology, but I won't bore you with that. But in a sense, what we are looking at is a table which has two columns. One is freedom, negative freedom, and the other is positive freedom. And then it has four rows for human being, for community, for nation state, and for the world as a whole. So you have 8 forms of freedom that you can think about in this, if we take the idea of Swaraj seriously. A Swaraj word may have come from the Indian tradition, but I think you would find similar notions in different parts of the world by different names.
Indeed, thank you. In fact,
thank you very much.
Yes, I have in the meantime had the chat question from Giselle, who wanted to ask you a question. She is going to ask this question in French, and then I will translate the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Giselle, can you please ask your question?
On n'entend pas.
Giselle, tu peux demander ta question, s'il te plaît?
Mais il n'y a pas de son. Je crois que Gisèle n'a pas le son en ce moment. Il faut brancher le son.
D'accord. Ah, ok, j'ai mis le micro. Ok, en attendant, tu demandes ta question à Andres. So Andres will ask the question while Giselle is dealing with her microphone.
Okay, I'd like just to maybe expand a little bit on the question of periphery and the way periphery allows you maybe to see things that when you are at the, you know, the center, in some sense like Western Europe or United States or whatever, are perhaps less visual, and that you can see from India or we can see from Colombia here. Can you maybe expand a little bit while Giselle's microphone will be fixed? Because I think that's a very important question.
Thank you for remembering that little thought that I shared. You know, in a sense, the whole tragedy, the problem of modern civilization is that it invites us to share its autobiography, not even its biography. The centers of power want us to share their autobiography, their life story as they want us to remember. That's the whole problem. So if you are, and the whole problem of much of the thought outside the periphery is that we become vicarious participants to their life stories. And in a sense, the trick to my mind is to refuse to share the story even vicariously, and to say, okay, I'm an outsider. As an outsider, you know, in essence, I'm an anthropologist of your civilization. I'm an outsider. Let me look at your civilization from outside and see what it is. And what you get to see is that what is presented as an exception is actually the norm. What is presented to you as an exception to democracy. So democracy is a lovely ideal. You have constitution, you have regular elections, you have, a constitutional rule and such like. And that is the norm. It so happens that that norm is not practiced in 90% of the world, which calls itself democratic. So in a sense, it's the tail which is wagging the dog, as the English expression would go. It's not the dog who's wagging the tail, it's the tail that's wagging the dog. For far too long, we've had that situation in the world. So the moment I start looking at democracy and I say, okay, that ideal is, A, doesn't operate here. B, I don't need to judge myself with reference to that ideal all the time. Something else is happening here. And the moment I do so, I begin to see a different face of modern civilization. And once I begin to understand my own country by not constantly comparing it to democratic ideals given by, say, Europe in the 19th and 20th century, but by trying to theorize what is happening, then that begins to give me insight into what Mr. Trump is doing in the US, because what he's doing is, or what's happening in Hungary for that matter, because that actually is closer to what's happening in my country than it is to the European ideals of democracy. So in a sense, what it enables us to do is to separate this business of norm and exception. For far too long, we have been conditioned to think that we live in a minor exception. I think it's time we started saying we are the norm. Certain parts of Western Europe or North America may have been an exception for a few years. That is not what the universe is like. I hope that responds to something that you had in mind.
Thank you.
Yes, I think this is an excellent response, not just to the Latin American situation, but situation, for example, in Africa. And I imagine that Giselle wants to ask about that, but she's still having some problems. So while we are waiting for her, the next question, Meenakshi already is ready to ask a question. So would you like to go ahead, Meenakshi? Please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you, Meenakshi.
Okay. Yeah, so that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Yadav, for this amazing presentation. And it was a lot to digest and listen to and digest in the time we had. But I just want to move away from what the other things that have been talked about and just focus on two points, and want you to tell me how these things connect with your idea of Swaraj. So these 2 points are, one is, when the COVID thing started and we all went into lockdown, the return of nature was what was uppermost in our minds. And we thought, now everybody's understood that nature is important and we are all going to learn our lessons. And now when lockdown's gradually easing up, those lessons seem to fade away slowly. So that one point about the ecological balance that we mustn't forget about, I mean, that must be the biggest lesson we have learned from the COVID crisis. And the second thing is about alternative vernacular knowledge, which you talked about, the erasure of vernacular knowledge. So how does these 2 points connect with your idea of Swaraj? How are they compatible, is the question.
Thanks, Meenakshi. One of the things we picked up during the pandemic and through the 70-day lockdown in India, it was a 70-day lockdown, as you would know. One of the things we discovered is that there were lots of things we were used to, but we actually could do without.
Yes.
Now that could come as a shock. That could come as something that would make us dread, or that could come as a liberating thought. I don't need to travel as much as I used to do. I don't need to consume large number of things that I used to do. And coupled it with the thought that actually my consumption came at the cost of someone else's non-consumption, that my carbon print was at the cost of someone else's life, is then something which leaves us with a deeper understanding that, okay, actually I can go slow. Actually, I can consume less. Actually, I need less. Now, the way it combines with the idea of Swaraj is because Swaraj is not merely about someone else externally not controlling you, but also about you being able to control yourself, you being able to determine your own life according to your needs and not on the basis of someone's television advertisements. When television advertisements control our life, we are living a life which is not a life of freedom. This is a life of unfreedom, which is connected to the thought about indigenous knowledge. You would, I suspect from your name that you have an Indian origin at least. So you would know about a great philosopher, Mr. K.C. Bhattacharya, who wrote a great article called Swaraj in Ideas, which is how do we begin to translate all because the ideas of Swaraj, of self-rule, etc., are usually seen in terms of politics, in terms of economy, who gets how much, who takes how much from whom. But the deepest source is cognition, knowledge, epistemology. Who decides what is correct knowledge? What is truth? Who controls standards of truth? And I'll just give you one example and stop there, which is, it is something that I have learned over the years from my wife, who happens to be someone who does research on traditional forms of medicine, non-modern forms of medicine. And the interesting thing is, that when Ayurveda is that system of medicine in India, which is centuries old, it's a textual written tradition with clear canons of itself. So how do you test the efficacy of an Ayurvedic drug? Modern medicine says, you have to do double-blind trial of the kind that I prescribe. I will lay down standards of how your medicine will be tested. Now, that is cognitive hubris, cognitive arrogance. That is that in a sense, what it does is it's an imperialism of one form of knowledge over another form of knowledge. So that is also something we need to liberate ourselves, and that is covered in this larger thing of Swaraj in ideas. And to my mind, in the last instance, Swaraj is not so much about politics, not so much about economy. It is in the last instance being able to free ourselves of concepts, of theories, of ideas, of notions of self-worth, notions of selfhood.
Thank you very much. Do you have any books written?
I could happily leave. I mean, I've written on specific aspects of it. There is a book I wrote which would be easily accessible to you with 2 American co-authors, which was on one aspect of these 5, on the nation state thing. We proposed a different ideal and we called it state nation. We said the world does not need nation states, the world needs state nations. That came from Johns Hopkins University Press. It is called State Nations. It's so old. I mean, I've left academia 7-8 years ago. So I have to remember the name of my own book. It's called Crafting State Nations. Crafting State Nations. Came in 2000.
Okay, so.
But I've also been writing. I've been writing on democracy. So I would be happy to share some of the writings there. But to be honest, all the 5 things came together only in this forced isolation during COVID. So thank you, COVID. You have helped me.
Well, yes, this self-reflection. Thank you very much. Well, we'll try to get these books somehow and post them somewhere. But in the meantime, I have a question from Gisela. Yes, now she typed it in the conversation. So, en effet, nous sommes créés des chaînes par des systèmes qui ne mettent pas l'homme à la base de leur fonctionnement. In fact, I think that we have been created in the change of systems that do not put the human being at the base of its functioning. Your talk makes me think that an interior transformation of beings, which is the one that is going to produce a global transformation. Hasn't this pandemic actually shown that this transformation is now becoming urgent? And she writes this in capital letters.
This transformation is becoming, I missed the last
urgent.
Urgent, yeah.
Yes, and she writes this in capital letters. And she says various spiritual thoughts have been going in the same sense as yours. They've been joining your thoughts. But one thing is to know, and another is how to do this transformation, which is now urgent. How to actually act on it. That is her question.
Thanks, Giselle. I can see you, and your question has reached me through double translation. So from text to voice, from French to English. But I can see the connect already looking at you. Yes, of course, it's urgent. There are moments which remind us of what's wrong with us. And it's only shocks like this. It's only an emergency like this. It's only an externally induced break that enables us to see, okay, what am I doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing? So yes, in a sense, it has exposed to us, as I said right in the beginning, you know, it began to come together in my mind when I was reading a book by Amitav Ghosh, Ghosh as in Ghosh. The book is called The Great Derangement. It's a book about ecology, environment, and climate change. And he says, look at us, you know, we can't even believe that we cannot control nature. You know, I mean, so people have faced nature's fury in the past. The problem with us is that earlier they knew nature was powerful. This time we can't even believe that nature can do things. So this is a moment for us to think. This is a moment for us to reflect. And many of our own creations are creations that have gone wrong. Our own creations have become monsters. The solution is therefore not to go back to nature. I mean, I'm not one of those who would say, go back to nature. I mean, there is no going back. There is no nature to go back to. They have to be human creations. But this is the time for us to modulate, for us to reconfigure, for us to refine, to change, and to realize that our creations have gone beyond us. The problem is not with nature. The problem is with us. We have created entities, these templates. These templates have become monsters. We need to break them down, chisel them, transform them. And so instead of saying, oh my God, liberal democracy is a great ideal, somehow I'm unable to realize it, let me realize it more honestly. Instead of that, can we say, well, in order to realize self-rule, we don't need liberal democracy of that kind. We need a different kind of polity. Maybe I can give it another name. Maybe I can draw something from Latin America. Maybe I can learn something from Africa. Maybe I can learn from Bangladesh. Or, of course, I'm happy to learn from Europe. But this is the moment for us to say, my older templates are not so useful, that we need to rethink them fundamentally, not just make minor shifts, not just make patchwork solutions. This is the moment to think afresh, because if we miss this moment, I don't know when the next moment will come for us to think afresh.
Indeed, but how do you make people think? That is,
Yes,
the ones around you here like to think.
Oh, lovely. I'm sorry, I forgot that that was the last bit of it. And the answer is politics. Myrna, you said, if this is politics, then I would like to do it. Because all of us have a very narrow understanding of what politics is. Politics for us is about statecraft. Politics for us is about what state does. But what we need is a deeper meaning of politics. And I once again go back to Mahatma Gandhi. And I talk of 5 kinds of politics, 5 forms of politics. First of course, politics is about power, about government, states, and so on and so forth. The second kind of politics is politics of struggle, which is what we associate social movements with, which seek to change power dynamics. The third kind of politics is what Mahatma Gandhi emphasized and talked about: constructive work, genuinely doing, genuinely changing the world ourselves, not waiting to get power, creating new models, doing constructive work. That's the third form of politics. The fourth form of politics is, of course, politics of knowledge, challenging categories, creating new concepts, shaping new language, creating new words. That is deeply political. So that's politics of the fourth kind. And the fifth kind that I would urge all of us to think about is politics of the inner self. We need to do inner engineering. We talk about equality, we talk about liberty, but all this is for the world outside. We never think about equanimity within. We never think about being free from within. This politics of the self is something we need to think about. So if we think of politics in these 5 senses of the term, then politics is the answer. The way to go forward is through politics.
I think this is a very deep and true answer. Another question from Giselle. Maybe we should accelerate that necessary transformation. Shouldn't we be inside of the power? Because only the people who are in the power have the capacity to accelerate reforms that are necessary to bring us a rapid change. For example, Rwanda, which succeeded in transforming the country in less than 20 years. What do you think? Well, let me just say before letting you answer this question that unfortunately our speaker of this afternoon, who is a Rwandan lady called Esther Mujawaho, hasn't been able to join us. I'm sure she would have interesting thoughts. Yeah, so.
Thanks for asking, Giselle. Of course, I do not rule out state power as one of the essential tools. I'm in a political party. I'm the president of a small political party, which is into challenging state power, which is into contesting elections. We have had no success, I must confess, but yes, we are into elections. So I would be the last person to say power does not matter. Of course it matters. All I'm saying is that it is necessary but not sufficient. And a change in power by itself, which is simply change in state power, who wields state power, is not enough unless you are able to change deeper structures. Power resides very often outside those who wield, those who occupy high state positions. Power resides very often in the ideas. Power resides in social structures. And unless you can challenge and change that, the most powerful people are actually very weak people. They are actually unable to do very much. As Mahatma Gandhi reminded us again and again, Gandhi's way was saying, all right, so you don't like the white man, you want the brown man to take power and do exactly what the white man does today. Is that your notion of freedom? And he said, this is not my notion of freedom. I don't want just the white man to go. I want that kind of regime to go. I want that understanding to go. I want the civilizational foundations of that to be transformed. And so that's the point. Power is important, is necessary, should be challenged, but any challenge done in the form of challenging state power and transforming state power must be accompanied by social, intellectual, and transformation of the inner self if we are thinking of deeper changes. Otherwise, my friends here would understand, what did so many years of communist regime achieve in Soviet Union? Everyone rushed back to churches thereafter. What did end of colonialism regime attain for many of our colonized countries? Simply the regime of some brown people or black people in the place of white people. We did achieve a few things, but that is not what true freedom is about. And the ideal of Swaraj enables us to see deeper layers without denying the top layer.
Well, it is very, very impressive to hear this. And if I didn't know any history, I wouldn't be able to believe you. But I do know the history. I know that Swaraj has won over the British Raj. And for me, this is one of the most beautiful victories of the human history. And I just hope that we will be able in the whole society, not just in India, to apply some of those ideals to have a better society afterwards. Thank you very much for your talk. I think it's now time for us to maybe take a few minutes break and resume at 4:15.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
Hi, George.
Jean-Marc, will you start?